Hey friends out there, Rob here. Today you ask and I answer. We're going to be talking about video frame rates for slow motion, specific to a camcorder that I've got right here in studio, but this would be general information that you can use just for your regular camera, camcorder, however you like to use it. This is good information to have to help you out. And as always, quick disclaimer and plug, if you find any of this helpful, please use the Amazon links down below. Give me a cup of coffee through PayPal if whatever I do is helpful to you. All those things support the channel. End of my absolutely shameless plug. So today we got a question from Apocalyptic God, and I got to tell you, the user description, the profile is a baying donkey. That's B-A-A-Y-I-N-G or B-E-E-Y. I don't know. It's a bay of some sort. So we can all laugh at that. It was a great question, interesting name and profile pic. Hey, I'm still using the HC-X1500. Okay. That's a camera that's from the 2016, 2015, 16 or 17, somewhere in there. I can't remember. I believe it was just before or a couple years before the HC-X1. Okay. So we're talking about a camera that's a little bit older, but hey, I'm still using the HC-X1000. I'm forever shooting in autofocus because I'm videoing horse riding lessons for the whole day and zooming in and out to follow the horse and rider. I would much rather be able to video on a shutter of 1/250th of a second because then I can get a lot better slow motion, but it just gets too dark. With the HC-X1500, this camera right here, make a huge difference? Has the HC-X1500 got a remote zoom controller plug like the X1000? I'd really appreciate that info. Yeah, Apocalyptic God, I got you covered. Yes, number one, it does have a remote. I actually have it. It's somewhere around here. I use it. I use it specifically when I put this camera on a gimbal. I'll talk about that in a second. You got two questions going on there. You're in autofocus, that's fine. I'm not going to worry about that. The HC-X1500 autofocus is absolutely outstanding. You've got wide, you've got area, face detect, stuff like that, and it's all modern. This is a 2020 camera, very modern in its approach to autofocus, and it works extremely well. If you are not familiar with Panasonic cameras, the Panasonic S5 Mark II is their first camera with phase detect hybrid autofocus that works also with contrast-based autofocus. This really brings Panasonic up to the modern age of hybrid phase detect autofocus like Canon, Sony, and Nikon. Panasonic has always leaned heavily on their depth from defocus technology, which is contrast-based, which leads to hunting. If you think about smooth autofocus, that's phase detect. When there's hunting, it's usually a sign of contrast detect. I state that to let you know that although cameras and camcorders by Panasonic sometimes get grouped together in terms of technology, Panasonic has always had much better contrast-based depth from defocus technology in their camcorders. I've always seen that the camcorders do great with, ever since the HC-X1 that I started using the cameras 4 years ago. So I have no problem with the autofocus on the camera, and the HC-X1 is an upgrade to what you're used to on the 1000. This is light years ahead of the HC-X1. So getting this camera or camcorder, and I might use those terms interchangeably, please bear with me. Getting this camcorder will automatically make using the camera much easier because the autofocus is much, much better. If you choose to shoot in the auto mode, which is a switch down here, you can, and you can also use the auto exposure level control and set that to a dial on the ring, right? That will give you then the ability to choose auto and have all of the advanced face detect autofocus features, as well as the excellent auto settings that are on this camera in the first place. It does very well in auto mode, but also give you some manual override up to 3 stops above and below the exposure that it's picking based on its subject. You can also choose to have the auto exposure function be face specific or scene specific. So it can identify a face and focus on the face, but still meter for the scene and expose for the scene and the face combined, or expose specifically for the face. Riding and videoing horses, you'll know you might be in backlit situations sometimes. You might be in shaded situations under trees. You might be in rolling meadows, things like that. So having the ability to choose exactly how the auto mode on this camera works could be a huge benefit to you. I don't often use the auto mode on the camera, and I don't understand why Fujifilm takes the face detect auto and only makes it available in the autofocus mode or in the auto mode, on the auto switch. You can't use it in manual mode. However, even in manual mode, I have found that my area select for subject detection, as well as my pinpoint for subject detection, works great. So I don't really have a problem. I do prefer face when I can get it, and that means working in auto. And since I don't work in auto as this slide manual right here, so I don't work in the auto mode all the time, I don't use it all the time. But when I do, I found it to be extremely good. I like it quite a bit. So let's move on to the second part of your question. This gets into something else. You're asking about 1/250th of a second. So you can do synchronized shooting on this camera, and you can do in-camera slow motion and things like that through the synchronized shooting function. You can do that on the HC-X1. It's a feature that the camera has built into it, meaning that the camera will take your synchronized shutter when you put it in the proper mode and create a slow motion clip, sometimes even with audio, depending on how slow you go. That's not the way that I prefer to do it, because the camera's doing the interpolation of that inside the camera, and I'd prefer to get that, for me, on the timeline in editing. So when you're asking about 1/250th of a second, that's generally because you want to make the camera darker, right? And you want to have more of a shutter speed to kind of have more images to segment through to slow down further. The problem that you're going to run into is your frame rate there. Usually when you think about slow motion, we're talking about slow motion in multiples of whatever frame rate you're editing in. In the United States, I generally edit on a 24-frame timeline, although I'm favoring 30 frames quite a bit more recently. And so if I'm going to shoot on a 24-frame timeline, I can shoot video at 48 frames a second on this camera and then slow it down to 50% slow motion in there. Again, I could shoot at 96 frames a second in camera and slow it down 4 times there. If you're shooting at any other frame rate, that would change. For example, if I was shooting at 30 frames a second, in order to get 2 times slow motion, I couldn't shoot and have smooth image at 48 frames as my capture rate. I'd have to shoot at 60. Same thing. If I wanted to get 4 times slow motion, I'd have to shoot at 120 on a 30 frame timeline. The thing that we run into here is your timeline needs to be the multiple of how you're going to shoot so that you can get the smooth slow motion that you're looking for. Also remember that each time you double your shutter rate, you half your light. You split the light. So that's why you're experiencing that it's darker. So if you want to shoot at a frame rate of 1/250th of a second, that would mean that your capture rate, your actual frame rate that you would be looking for, would be around 1/125th. That's not exactly a perfect multiple, and it's not a perfect multiple because most people don't shoot at 1/125th. The common frame rates that we're going to shoot are 24, 23,997, 24, 29,997, 30, 48, 50, 60, and even 60 is 59.97. So the reality is, if you want to get better slow motion, you can shoot at that higher frame rate, and what you will end up getting are more frames, but the camera is only going to record 60 of those frames at its highest. It only does 60p, right? So it's only going to record 60. So it's still, even if you put your shutter speed up to 1/250th of a second, the shutter is going to open and close. The electronic gate is going to open and close 250 times a second, right? But your capture is only going to be a portion of that at 1/60th of a second. So your frames will be further apart and look more jittery or choppy. Now, you may not have experienced that, because I will agree that that is a minute detail. If you do it right, it can look great and work that way. In fact, I've cranked my system that way in the past to get some kind of slow motion. The better thing to do, I would suggest, would be to use a neutral density filter in order to get your ambient light correct, which the camera has built into it, and then shoot at the multiple of the frame rate that you're going to be working in. So if you're working in a 24 frames per second timeline, then you could shoot in 24 frames per second. You could go up to 1/240th of a second, and at that point in time, you'd have 10 times slow motion when slowed down. Again, there might be some smoothness issues because the camera is only going to record, if you're capturing in 60 frames a second, it's only going to capture 60, so it's going to be kind of choppy there. At that point in time, you could switch to a synchronization mode, a slow synchro mode on the camera, and that would record more direct, but it would also create a video file for you that was less usable in my opinion because the camera is interpolating all of that into an image file for you, to a video file, and then you would just use that video file rather than doing it in post-production. Those are the two best ways to go about it. No matter what, when you up the frame rate, you're going to get darker. So if you're upping the frame rate, your image is going to get darker. If you're doing that because it's bright outside, then I would say don't do that and use a neutral density filter. If you're doing that because you believe that you're getting better slow motion, I would suggest try out a couple different ways and give that synchronization, the slow synchro scan, a shot. Read the manual. If what I've talked about here sounds a little bit unusual or unfamiliar to you, and you'll be able to kind of get a handle of it pretty quickly. More importantly, will an upgrade to a camera like this help? Without a question, undoubtedly, yes. And I believe that in this instance, Apocalyptic God, the user that asked this question, has experience using cameras. He or she brings it up, right? And because of that experience, buying a relatively expensive, but, well, expensive is something else. Buying a $1,700 product like this without the top handle, that's what the X1500 costs, $1,700 for this alone, $300 for this. So it's a $2,000 package, even today in 2023. I believe that you would have plenty of experience and that this piece of hardware would actually be an appreciable upgrade for you. Sometimes people ask me if getting a camera because of XYZ, and they don't have the experience to use it. So it's got features they wouldn't even know how to use. I don't think you're in that category. So I think that you would definitely benefit from the newer sensor, better in low light, better zoom, better codecs, better bit rate, better resolution, and samples. I mean, like 24-bit or audio, things like that. 10-bit color compared to 8-bit. Resolution 4K 60 DCI, 4K, which is the 4096 4K if you wanted it 24 frames. Also, if you add a Blackmagic, it's not a Blackmagic, but if you add an Atomos Ninja 5 to this, you can record that 10-bit 4K out at whatever resolution you're doing and frame rate you're doing, and record it into a DNX HR profile that's on the Ninja, and you will have a very high quality external recording to use for editing. And because the HDMI will do 10-bit 4K up to 60 frames a second, you're not losing any processing. So if you shoot in a flat profile here, it will give you something between the flat profile internal to the camera and more of a flat raw profile. It does not do raw. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it'll give you more editing options. Just remember to shoot in a flat profile. If not, the 200 megabits per second 422 or 420 60, or the 150 megabits per second 422 30 are great options to shoot and deliver with very minimal processing. I absolutely love this camera. Buttons irritate me sometimes, but Apocalyptic God, I hope that this answered your question. If it did, and I did a good job, and I know I did. So if it feels so good to move you, please, if you choose to get one, use my Amazon links down below. Thank you for your question. Users out there, if you find this helpful, please leave your comments down below if you've got some information to add to share light on the subject. And if I've done a good job for you and you guys want to support what I'm doing, use those Amazon links or send me a cup of coffee through PayPal. Totally appreciate it. I want to thank you guys for watching and remind you I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye for now.